One day, the machine stopped for the last time. After 200 years of cloth manufacturing at the Military Cloth Factory in Usserød, north of Copenhagen, production was stopped. A chapter of Danish textile history had come to an end. The history of the factory is closely tied to the waterways. Early industries needed power, and since textile production in particular uses plenty of water, the obvious place to locate a factory was at a stream. By the end of the 18th century, industrial development had reached north of Copenhagen, at first by the Lyngsø River, and when that was fully used up, further north at Usserød River. It was here that the history of the cloth factory began, when in 1791 a private enterprise was allowed to build a wool factory at Usserød. The factory soon expanded to comprise no less than 3 complexes. On a map dated 1815, the cloth factory Bjørnholmsdal is seen located at Usserød River. If you follow the stream, the old works can be seen north of the King's Road, while the new works can be seen on the opposite side of the road. The factories constituted an integrated miniature society with their own doctor, hospital, school and home farm. At the beginning of the 19th century, 450 people found work here. 1/3 of them were poor orphans who were employed at the machines. Later, one of them wrote in his memoirs,
"In the spring of 1818, Councillor P sent me to Usserød Cloth Factory. Here I came to a nursing house where there were 80 children. I was there from my 12th to my 14th year, and this was long enough to learn all the ungodliness one can imagine, and which I didn't even know existed. I will not mention them here, for drinking, swearing and fighting here were the most trivial vices. This was a school of sin, where one was taught such vices which thousands hardly had any notion of."
During the wars with England from 1807 to 1814, the factory was given the task of producing cloth for army supply. The experiment was successful and was the start of a cloth production which was to continue for more than 150 years. Military life was more than exercises and parades. Most often it was camp life in the open. Under those circumstances, survival was not only a question of guns and gunpowder. The soldiers were also highly dependent on their equipment. During the War of 1864, the Usserød factory came into its own. But despite its success, Liberals tried to have the now state-owned factory returned to private hands. But every time they failed. The army wanted to be sure of its supplies. The cloth factory continued to expand. In 1860, a steam engine was installed because water power from the stream alone was no longer able to run the heavy machines. Near the factory, a long timbered building with room for 36 families had been erected. But most workers lived in the factory's hinterland. Only few photographs exist to illustrate work at the factory towards the turn of the century. This one shows the steam engine room. On the other hand, there are several pictures of workers and office clerks lined up in neat rows in front of the factory. One of the men appearing on many of these group pictures is the now 87-year-old Carl Andersen.
Ja, jeg var kun 12 år, da jeg kom ned som dreng i efteråret 1911.
I was only 12 when I came down as a lad in the autumn of 1911. As soon as we came from school, we were 2 who started at the same time. We had to help the weaver tie a new chain into the threads. Tying for the weaver gave us an extra compensation of 2 øre per 100 threads. What's that? That's a kroner for 5,000 threads. We received a fixed amount every week for turning the spinning wheel and winding yarn leftovers together. There was an amusement association, as it was called, for the workers, and clerks took part too. This association had several balls throughout the winter, and I remember as a small boy, when we children were present at the dances, being put to bed on pieces of cloth so that the others could enjoy themselves. Everything was very free down there then. We were allowed to run about nearly anywhere we wanted to. That is, when we had nothing else to do.
Man kunne næsten rende, hvor man ville, når ikke man lige havde noget at foretage sig.
In the middle of the 1930s, the amount of water in the stream decreased, and the factory built a new machine house with a steam turbine and generator to help the existing steam engine. Life at the military cloth factory continued its course until the end of the 70s, when the factory was mercilessly overtaken by modern development. Obsolete machinery and cheap foreign textiles eventually put a stop to cloth production in Usserød. Without much of a fuss, the factory was finally shut down in 1981. The old textile machines were removed and the buildings were left to the mercy of destiny. Surrounding the factory is a well-preserved environment bearing the marks of early industrialism. The stream, small lakes and ponds tell of a time when water power was used intensively. South of the old cloth factory is Stampen, once part of the powerful factory complex. Stampen has now been placed under a conservation order and the buildings are being used anew. The old workers' living quarters at Blåstrødvej have also been preserved. So has this 200-year-old doctor's residence on Kongevejen, or the King's Road. But the factory itself, what's happened to that? The buildings have been declared a national monument, but it takes more than an official document to stop decay. The declaration has secured the old buildings, but at the same time it called for restoration. After negotiations with the Ministry of Defence, an electronics company, Søren T Lyngsø, took over the buildings with a view to converting them into a research centre. The overall objective of the restoration is to preserve and reuse as much as possible of the old buildings. In certain places, however, it was necessary to tear down some of the walls in order to accommodate the new functions. Otherwise, the original partitions are used. Eventually, as work progresses, several surprises turn up. Here, it appears to be necessary to change the flooring in the lofts due to major fungal attacks stemming from leaky roofs. The buildings are first-class constructions of high craftsmanship, but no buildings can survive if they're not used. As restoration progresses, it turns out that part of the bearing construction has been weakened by rot, which has forced its way up from the basement. And suddenly, damage from a 1915 fire comes to light. The rot attack and the fire damage require the reinforcement of parts of the building, reinforcements done with sectional iron girders. In the older buildings, there was a characteristic type of window which has been used as a model for the production of new windows. It would have been preferable to keep the original windows, but the windows had been neglected for many, many years, and there were several other, later types, which were foreign to the buildings. Furthermore, fire regulations demand hinged windows which can open. The new windows respect the bar divisions and dimensions of the old type and are fitted with double glazing. One layer of glass is an inside screen. When restoring old buildings, special attention should be paid to the windows. Hardly any other part of a building marks the general impression to any major extent as the windows do. The windows in the new concrete buildings from 1949 are typical of industrial constructions of that era. In these buildings, the original windows will be used. The windows are made from thin, drawn steel mouldings. Today, it's not even possible to make windows with such narrow bars. After corrosion treatment, the windows are painted with original paint, which gives the characteristic grey metal surface. Originally, there was only single glazing, but nowadays this is unacceptable for energy conservation reasons. Therefore, it was necessary to develop a special thermopane which fits the old dimensions. The new thermopanes are easily pressed into the old window bars, and you have a modern, tight window. Although the thermopanes are made to order, this solution is no more expensive than fitting completely new windows. As far as possible, the original partitions are maintained. Walls are erected in glass and in several cases in connection with earlier partitions. The old wooden floors were damaged by seeping oil from the machines. Therefore, a new floor's laid out before carpeting. The open plan solution puts special demands on acoustics. Comprehensive measurements form the basis of special baffle plates attached underneath the ceiling. They're small flat cases filled with glass wool and with a baffle plate lowest. Along with the carpet, the baffle plates are prerequisites for a good working environment in the large rooms. Jørgen Raaschou-Nielsen, the architect behind the restoration, explains.
I forbindelse med den ombygning, vi er i gang med her, har det været væsentligt for os.
In restoring and rebuilding, it's been essential for us to maintain the features typical of the buildings we're working with. We're dealing with buildings stretching over a time span of 150 years, with the oldest dating back to 1790 and the newest from the 1950s. When we're rebuilding such constructions, it's important for us to preserve their special features, and to make sure that the office plans and what have you, which will come after we've left the site, respect the original character of the buildings. We're dealing with typical industrial architecture, and it's been essential for us to preserve the industrial character. This should also show up in the details we've maintained and developed. It's important too that the various industrial functions the buildings will house can fit together with the physical framework of the place. We've had to adapt a ventilation system. We've had to adapt wiring installations for comprehensive computer production. This turned out to be complicated in certain buildings whilst they fitted in comfortably in others. However, it's been a bit of a puzzle, and we've been forced to work out different solutions for different buildings, since a standard solution for the whole complex was impossible. If we'd applied a standard solution throughout, we would have destroyed the unique features of some of the buildings.
Hvis vi gjorde det, så ville vi ødelægge nogle af bygningernes særkende.
At last, the first rooms are ready in their new livery. The exterior of the factory is also nearly ready. The walls are looked over and faulty bricks replaced. The surface treatment of the facade is the last thing. Some walls have to be rendered first, whilst others can be painted directly on grounder. The surface of the buildings serve as a sort of climatic screen. For concrete buildings in particular, it's important to carry out tests and calculations to determine what kind of insulation permits the walls to breathe. The factory's tile roofs are relatively new, so only minor repairs are needed in places where the underlying bearings have been attacked by fungus. Towards the end of the project, it's clear that the purchase and restoration of the old buildings have been as expensive as a newly built factory would have been. But by choosing restoration, the client received an additional asset in a unique environment. Whilst the bricklayers are putting the last tiles in place, the future users of the building have moved in. Right at the top, beneath the old roof, the heart of the new company is to have its seat. A well-insulated room for the central computers. The old folks at the cloth factory would hardly have imagined the type of machinery now replacing the old textile machines. Jakob Lyngsø, the managing director, explains the background for choosing the old cloth factory for the company's new research center.
Vi har været lidt heldige. Vi har igennem flere år haft en vækst. Det vil sige, vi har været i medvind.
We've been fortunate. We've experienced growth for several years and were outgrowing our old premises. We found ourselves in a situation where we were to build something entirely new. We were acutely aware that if we wanted to attract the kind of people we'd like to have in our firm, that is, imaginative and creative experts in datology and information technology, we had to offer other facilities than those given in an ordinary office building. This was our reason for starting to look for an alternative possibility, and we stumbled across the Military Cloth Factory. Now, for this to have become a reality, it's obvious that we've received help from many places. In particular, the National Agency of Physical Planning has given us magnificent support. We've respected the fact that the exterior of the buildings had to look exactly the same as they always had. But inside, we've had the chance to get something which, in my opinion, is better than anything we could have had in a new building. The proportions of the building are such that we have easily been able to create good working conditions.
The cloth factory in Usserød was famous for its uncompromising attitude to quality. With this attitude, it survived for nearly 200 years. Much has been changed since then, but new life has been created behind the old facades. And the buildings are now saved for posterity.